Hello, I want to talk to you briefly about folk literature. Um, Folk literature is what is known as all forms of narrative. Narrative means it's a story, so it follows that Freytag pyramid, that story arc. So it's all forms of story that have been either written or have been told orally and have been handed down through the years. In the standards for the state of Texas, this is what is called traditional literature. These are stories that were initially told orally. And when we say that they were told orally, the storyteller was a very highly respected position in the community. And we're talking about hundreds of years ago. So if you think about what we do now in families after dinner, we gather around the television and we watch television. We're watching stories on TV. So hundreds of years ago, they didn't have that. They would gather in the village and storytellers would entertain them. Many times these stories were aimed at adults, but children listened in. After the period of scientific enlightenment, adults became less interested in spending their time listening to stories, and the children began to embrace the stories. There are many things that fall under this broad category of folk literature: fairy tales, folk tales, legends, fables, myths, epics, folk songs, even ballads, riddles, ghost stories. All of those things are stories that have been handed down orally through the generations, and they all fall under this broad category of folk literature or traditional literature. There's lots of reasons why children enjoy folk literature. They tell good stories. If you think about those storytellers, they had to entertain the public, and so the stories were memorable and enjoyable. They tend to be short and they move pretty quickly. A lot of times they're humorous, and children love humor. They almost always end happily. Good is rewarded and bad is punished. And wishes come true for the main character, but only after a trial or a task that they have to overcome. And many times the littlest or the youngest character wins out over the biggest or oldest. So naturally, children like that. I'm going to talk about a couple of names, a couple of people in this field that you need to know. The first one is a man named Northrop Frye. He is a literary critic who was known for what is called archetypal criticism. So what Frye did, he spent his time researching folk tales because he believed that children should be exposed to archetypes. Archetypes are defined as recurring patterns in literature. So they are themes that you're going to see over and over again. Things like good versus evil, damsel in distress, star-crossed lovers. If you go on to Google and you search for literary archetypes, you can find lots of lists of them. So what Frye said was that the Bible was the best place to find archetypes. And if you think about it, the Bible is a book filled with stories, just like the Quran is, or Edith Hamilton's mythology. But at the time, Frye believed that the Bible was the best place to find archetypes. And he said that if children were exposed to common archetypes early in their lives, they would understand them better as they read them in other stories later on in life. So it would help their comprehension later in life. Another name that I'd like for you to know is a man named Bruno Bettelheim. Bettelheim was a Freudian psychologist. He worked with severely troubled teenagers, and he wanted to find books that would help these troubled teenagers. So he also researched folk literature, and he came up with a list of reasons why fairy tales, in particular, are important to a child's development. He wrote about them in this book, The Uses of Enchantment, the Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales. So here's what Bettelheim theorized. He said that these stories are helpful to children because they represent our common heritage. If you look at fairy tales, some of our most common fairy tales are present in many cultures in this world. He said that they show that life is a struggle. They emphasize moral values. They provide models for troubled children to emulate, and they also speak to issues that children think about but that adults don't want to talk about. So, what happens if one of your parents dies? Or how do parents feel about children? Which one is the favorite? Parents don't want to talk about those things with their children, and those kinds of topics show up in fairy tales. So Bettelheim believed that the best fairy tales to use were those that come closest to the oral stories that had been passed down from generations. So the ones that stuck closest to the originals. He recommended two specific collections. He recommended the English fairy tales that were collected by Joseph Jacobs, and then the other ones he recommended were these pictured on the right. These are the fairy tales that were collected by a man named Andrew Lang, Lang. And these fairy tales, they're separate books, and they are titled based on the color of the cover. So, for example, one would be called the Green Fairy Book, one is the Yellow Fairy Book. So Bettelheim liked these two collections specifically because they come closest to the oral stories that have been passed down. So let's talk about some types of folk tales. The first type of folk tale or folk literature I want to mention is what are called formula stories. They're called formula stories because they have a very distinct pattern, and there are four kinds of formula stories. The first kind is called a catch tale. And a catch tale is a story that a storyteller would tell to trick the audience, to kind of get them to move on. So anytime you have a story or a tale that is designed to trick the listener, that's what's called a catch tale. Endless tales. Endless tales are another kind of formula story. They're stories that don't have an ending. Remember, folk songs fit under folk literature. So I'm sure that many of you are familiar with a song called "This is the Song That Never Ends." That's an example of an endless tale. A chain tale is another kind of formula story, and it's a story in which one event is linked to another. So a good example of that is the story by Laura Numeroff called "If You Give a Mouse a Cookie." And the final kind of formula story is what is known as a cumulative tale. This is a tale where one event is added on to the last one. So The Napping House by Audrey Wood. This is the house that Jack built, another example. There was an old lady who swallowed a fly. So those are four kinds of formula stories, which are one type of folk tale. A beast tale is another type of folk tale. A beast tale is a story that has talking animals. So The Three Little Pigs, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Charlotte's Web, those are beast tales. A noodlehead story is another type of folk tale. As you can see, it says this is where you have a likable tale, or a likable fool. So this is, I think of TV shows when I think of this. I Love Lucy. Lucy would be the likable fool. Or Gilligan's Island. Gilligan is the likable fool. Another type of folktale is called a pourquoi story. Pourquoi is the French word for why. So these are stories that answer a why question. For example, why mosquitoes buzz in people's ears. That's an example of a pourquoi story. Wonder tales. This is what we in America most often call a fairy tale. This is another type of folk tale. These often incorporate magic, the supernatural, idealized love, that kind of thing. And finally, the last type of folktale is what's called a realistic story. This is a folktale that has been based in truth and has been added to or embellished over time. So I also want to share with you some literary aspects of a folk tale. These are aspects that scholars have researched, and what they did is they looked at folk tales from different cultures around the world, and they found that they all have some things in common. So with plot in folk tales from around the world, you have simple and direct plots Characters in conflict are often presented at the very beginning of the story. So once upon a time, there was a pretty young girl who lived among the ashes in the house of her stepmother and stepsisters. Okay, so you see that right off the bat. A lot of times there's repetition. So, for example, in Jack and the Beanstalk, fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. That repetition was there for the storyteller, much like a refrain in music, to help them kind of put them on autopilot for a minute so they could think about what's the next part of the story. So folk tales around the world tend to have some repetition. In terms of theme, the similarity across folk tales is that the theme is generally easy to detect and it's usually positive. For setting, the similarity is that it's very non-specific and generally time passes quickly. So if you think about Snow White, after she ate the poison apple, how long was she asleep? That happens in the turn of a page in that story. Characterization. What's common about characterization in folk tales around the world is that the characters are generally going to be flat, so we don't know a whole lot about their innermost thoughts, and they tend to be very stereotypical. And finally, the commonality with style is that dialogue is important. Dialogue is what gives you an indication of the culture of origin. And then magic and the numbers 3 and 7 tend to be prevalent. In fact, there is a standard in our Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills at the 6th grade level that talks about teaching students the rule of 3. So if you think about 3 or 7 in folk literature, think for a little bit about how often those numbers show up. They show up because they were believed to have magical qualities. And then also different cultures and values show up in folk literature from around the world. So when you're evaluating written editions of folk tales, you want to look for a couple of things. You want to make sure that it has an oral storytelling quality. So when you read the book out loud, you want it to sound like somebody would be telling an oral story. So longer sentences instead of short, choppy sentences. And also you want to look to see if there's indication of the country or the culture of origin. That's going to be subtle. It's not going to be very direct. In a couple cases it is. For example, the Chinese Cinderella or the Korean Cinderella. Those are titles of books. That's pretty obvious. But if it's not obvious like that, you're going to have to do some reading and thinking about it. So the culture of origin might show up through food. It might show up through the dialect used, that kind of thing. One of the current trends is that some people are taking folk tales and making them readable for younger children. That means they're making them into easy readers. When you're looking at them, it's really important to remember what Bettelheim said. The ones that students are going to learn the most from are those that are closest to the oral storytelling tradition. That's why I have you read Paul Zelinsky's Rumpelstiltskin. It's a good example of that. So just because a folk tale is an easy reader doesn't mean it's necessarily the best choice for kids. Last thing I want to mention is some criticisms of folk literature. Some people say that folk literature can be too scary for children. And the implication is that as the teacher, you need to stick with your gut feeling when you choose which version of a fairy tale to share. So if you're choosing a version from the Grimm brothers, know that it's probably too scary for young children. In the Grimm's version of Cinderella, the stepsisters cut off parts of their foot to make their feet fit into the glass slipper. The versions that came down from Perrault, who was a Frenchman, much milder. Okay, so you just always need to stick with your gut. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to share with you another video in just a moment on subsets of folk literature.